A small flame, cupped in two hands, carried across an open field where the wind will not stop trying to find it. That is where tonight begins. Not in a temple, not on a mountain, but in the ordinary act of trying to protect something fragile while the world keeps moving around it. If you are here tonight because your mind will not stop walking through everything that could still go wrong, you are in exactly the right place. This is not a night for solving anything. It is a night for finally setting something down. Come in from wherever you have been standing guard. Let your shoulders remember they do not have to hold the sky up tonight. There is nothing here that needs your vigilance. Nothing waiting to test you in the dark. I want to tell you something honestly. Before we begin, I have spent long nights the same way many of you have, rehearsing conversations that never happened, bracing for a version of tomorrow that never arrived. What changed was not that I stopped caring. It was that I found older, quieter minds who had already walked this exact road and who left something behind for the ones who would come after. Still awake, still worrying, still trying to carry too much with both hands. Tonight we walk through 11 such moments, drawn from the Zen monasteries of Tang and Song dynasty China, from village life along the coasts of old Japan, and from ordinary households in early Vietnam, where someone, long before you were born, sat with this exact same weight and found a way to lay it down. These are not the famous stories. They are the quiet ones, which somehow understand a worried mind even better. These stories are contemplative in nature and are not a substitute for medical or therapeutic care. Let your eyes close whenever they are ready to. There is nowhere else you need to be, and nothing left to prepare for. The only thing asked of you tonight is to breathe, to listen, and to let the hands that have been holding on for so long finally, slowly, to begin to open. Somewhere behind you tonight, a small flame is still traveling between two hands, and it does not need you to watch it every moment for it to keep burning. It only needs to be tended, gently, and then trusted. There is a particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with the body. You know it if you have ever lain in bed with your eyes closed, still working, still checking, still running through everything that has not gone wrong yet, as though your attention alone were the only thing keeping it that way. Maybe it is a job that could fall apart if you look away for a day. Maybe it is a child sleeping down the hall, or a parent whose phone has not rung, or a future that has not arrived yet but already feels heavy in your chest. Maybe it is smaller than any of that. A conversation you are bracing to have tomorrow. A bill you have already checked twice tonight. A small ache in your body you keep pressing on just to see if it is still there. You have convinced yourself, quietly, that if you stop watching, even for a moment, the worst will slip through the gap you left open, and that the only thing standing between safety and disaster is how tightly you are able to hold your attention on it. The Buddha taught that suffering often grows not from the difficulty itself, but from the belief that our vigilance is the only thing holding the difficulty back. Long ago, on the western coast of Japan, in a small fishing village, where the sea took as much as it gave, a woman learned this the hard way. Through a lantern, she would not let herself stop watching. Her name was Sutsu, and for 11 years, she had kept the harbor lantern burning on the rocks above the cove. It was a simple flame, fed with fish oil and a woven wick, but every boat that went out at night found its way home by it, threading between the rocks in the dark by that one steady point of orange light. The wind came off the dark water first, salt heavy and cold, carrying with it the far-off, steady creak of hulls straining softly at anchor. Closer. The oil in its clay dish gave off a thin, mineral smell, mixed with the char of the wick. Closest of all was the gentle warmth against her hands when she leaned in to trim it. A small circle of heat in the middle of so much dark and moving night air. By the third night, Suzu had not slept at all. Not because there was a storm, and not because the fleet was out later than usual, but because she had convinced herself, slowly and without noticing, that the flame needed her eyes on it at every hour, awake or not, or it would gutter out the moment she looked away. She trimmed the wick when it did not need trimming. She refilled the oil when the dish was still half full. She sat upright against the cold stone wall of the lantern house long after her body had begun begging her to lie down, telling herself that this was devotion, that this was what it meant to keep her village safe. Her eyes had grown red at the rims. Her hands had begun to shake faintly when she reached for the oil jug, not from cold, but from a tiredness that had settled somewhere deeper than muscle. Twice that week, her sister had come up the winding cliff path, carrying rice and dried fish, only to find her sitting in exactly the same position she had been in the day before, as though she had not moved at all, as though moving might be the very moment the flame chose to fail. Suzu had waved her away both times, insisting she was fine, insisting that someone had to stay close to the light, and her sister had gone back down the path shaking her head, unable to find the words to reach her. On the third night, an old traveling monk came up the cliff path in the rain, soaked through, looking for shelter before the storm worsened. Suzu let him into the lantern house without much thought, too tired to be curious about a stranger, and went back to watching the flame as though he were not there. "You have not slept," the monk said, not as a question. "I can't," Suzu said. "If I close my eyes, even for a moment, the flame might die, and a boat might miss the rocks, and someone's husband or son would be lost, and it would be because I was resting instead of watching." The monk was quiet for a while, letting the rain fill the silence. Then he said, "My mother kept a lantern too, on a cliff much like this one, when I was a boy." "Then you understand," Suzu said. "I understand something," he said. "She died the same way you are dying right now, slowly, one sleepless night at a time. Not from the sea. The sea never took a single boat that lantern was meant to guide. It was the watching itself that wore her down to nothing, long before her body finally gave out. The flame outlived her by 40 years. It is still burning tonight, tended now by someone else's hands, in a village she has been gone from for a lifetime." Suzu felt something in her chest tighten and then, strangely, loosen, as though the monk had named a shape she had been carrying without ever looking directly at it. Then what was the point of her watching so hard? She asked, if the flame did not need it. The flame needed tending, the monk said. It never needed her fear. Those are two different things, and she spent her whole life mistaking one for the other. He nodded toward the lantern, its light steady and unbothered by either of them. "Look at it now. It has burned through worse storms than this one, without either of us awake to guard it. It only asks to be fed when it runs low. The rest of the time, it simply burns, the way fire does, whether or not anyone is brave enough to look away. But what if something happens while my eyes are closed? Suzu asked, her voice smaller now, less certain than it had sounded in years. What if the one night I finally rest is the night it goes wrong? Then you will wake, and you will tend to it, the same as you always have, the monk said. Fear does not make you faster to notice trouble. It only makes you too tired to respond well when it comes. A rested hand trims a wick better than an exhausted one ever could. Suzu looked at the flame for a long moment, really looked at it, the way she had not allowed herself to in years, not as a danger to be managed, but as a small, ordinary, faithful thing doing exactly what fire does. She thought of all the nights she had spent rigid against the stone wall, certain that her exhaustion was love, when it might only have been fear wearing love's clothing. Sleep, the monk said gently. I will sit with the lantern tonight. Not because it needs guarding, but because it is easier to trust something when you are not doing it entirely alone. For the first time in 3 nights, Suzu lay down on the thin mat in the corner of the lantern house, and though her mind reached for the old habit of watching, her body was too tired to obey it any longer. She closed her eyes to the sound of rain on the roof and the low, steady presence of the monk beside the flame, and she slept. She woke near dawn to find the lantern still burning, exactly as it always had, exactly as it always would, whether her eyes were open or closed. The monk was gone, the rain had passed, and far out on the water, a small fishing boat was making its way home by the same orange light that had guided boats home for 11 years, tended now and then, watched with fear never again. The flame did not need her eyes. It had only ever needed her hands. And hands. She was beginning to understand, could rest while still holding. She walked down to the rocks that morning, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself sit in the wet grass and simply watch the boats come in, not as a duty, but as something closer to wonder. The grass was cold and damp beneath her, soaking through her sleeves, where she leaned back on her hands, and she noticed, as though for the first time, how good the morning air felt against her face after so many nights spent indoors with her eyes fixed on one small point of light. Something in her had loosened overnight that she suspected would take a long time to fully unclench, but she recognized, faintly, the shape of a different way to keep a light burning, one that did not require disappearing into the watching of it. That evening, when dusk came again, she found herself walking back up to the lantern house without the old dread in her chest, and she tended the flame the way one might greet an old friend rather than guard a fragile enemy. And somewhere beneath that recognition, quieter still, was the beginning of a harder question, one she did not yet have words for. If watching had never been what kept the flame alive, then what, exactly, had she been so afraid of losing control over? Sit with that question for a moment, because it may be closer to your own than it first appears. What Suzu was actually holding was never the lantern. It was the belief that her suffering was proof of her love. That exhaustion was the entrance fee for care. This is a mechanism worth naming gently. The mind often confuses vigilance with protection, as though staying awake to a danger were the same as preventing it. The Buddha pointed to this directly when he spoke of the second arrow, the wound we add to the first, simply by refusing to put down our guard against it. The lantern was never in danger. 2. Tsuvas. Think of your own version of the lantern house. The email you reread at midnight, not because reading it again will change anything, but because stopping feels like abandoning something. The worry you carry about someone you love, certain that if you stopped worrying, even for an hour, something in the universe would notice and take advantage of the gap. Think of the last time you told yourself you could not rest yet, that there was still one more thing to check, one more scenario to run through, before you had earned the right to close your eyes. This is not weakness. It is a very old, very human mistake, mistaking fear for devotion. Watching is not the same as loving. Fear is not the same as care. The flame burns on its own. You do not have to disappear into the thing you are protecting in order to protect it well. Let your shoulders remember, the way Suzus finally did, that they were never built to hold up an entire night by themselves. Feel the weight of your own head sinking a little deeper into the pillow beneath it. Heavier now than it was a few minutes ago. The particular heaviness that only comes right before sleep. Somewhere, whatever you have been quietly guarding is still there, still tended, still held by hands other than only your own. You do not have to watch it tonight. Let your breath slow the way a flame settles once the wind outside has finally died down. In, and then a longer, looser out. Again, in and out, no longer needing to be managed, only allowed. Feel your jaw unclench, just slightly, the small muscles around your eyes softening from a squint you did not realize you were holding. The lantern is burning. It does not need your eyes to keep burning. It never did, and it never will, and that has always, quietly, gently, been allowed to be true. And somewhere ahead, in the quiet hours still to come tonight, another kind of watching waits to be looked at more closely, the kind that convinces us we can control a storm simply by never looking away from it, and what it might mean to finally set that kind of watching down as well. And perhaps, as the harbor lantern kept burning on its own that night, another kind of watching was still waiting in the dark, one that does not live in a lighthouse at all, but in the quiet, constant bracing so many of us carry against a future that has not happened yet. There is a particular way the mind tries to protect itself from hard times before they arrive. It rehearses the bad outcome so thoroughly that it starts to feel like preparation, like standing guard. You might recognize it as the habit of imagining every way a plan could fail before you have even begun it, or checking the same worry over and over as though repetition were a kind of insurance. Perhaps you keep a certain sum of money untouched, not for any specific need, but because spending it would mean admitting you believe things might actually be all right. Perhaps you decline small comforts you can easily afford, a warmer coat, a better meal, an evening of rest, because some quiet part of you believes that comfort now will be punished by hardship later, as though the universe were keeping a ledger, and any pleasure taken today must be repaid with suffering tomorrow. Some of us do this quietly, in the privacy of a sleepless mind. Others do it with our hands, saving things we do not need, refusing to spend what we have earned, holding tightly to whatever feels like protection against a version of tomorrow that has not come and may never come at all. Underneath both is the same quiet belief, rarely spoken aloud: if I suffer enough now, in advance, perhaps I can keep the real suffering from ever arriving. The Buddhist teaching on cause and effect says something gentler than most of us expect. It says that our actions shape what follows, not our fear. Worry is not currency. It cannot be spent to purchase safety, no matter how much of it we offer up. Long ago, in a mountain monastery in Tang Dynasty, China, a young monk learned this from a bell that finally cracked. And in a small village in the Li dynasty of old Vietnam, a widow learned it from a chest of cloth that never once kept anyone warm. Jian had joined the monastery 3 years earlier, and from his first winter there, he had taken it upon himself to protect it. Every morning before the other monks woke, while the mountain was still wrapped in a cold blue dark, he lit a small oil lamp before the shrine and recited a long prayer against drought, against bandits, against sickness among the brothers, against every misfortune he could name and several he had invented for the occasion. He rang the temple bell an extra time each hour beyond what the schedule required, believing that the sound itself kept danger at bay. Its low bronze note rolling out over the valley like a second heartbeat laid on top of his own. The lamp's flame trembled each morning in the cold air of the shrine room, small and orange against the dark stone, and Jian watched it the way a man watches something he believes he alone is keeping alive. His knees had grown calloused from the stone floor. His voice had gone hoarse from years of the same recited words, repeated so many times they had begun to lose their shape in his mouth, becoming sound rather than meaning. By his 3rd year, Jian's hands had begun to shake from lack of sleep, and the other monks had grown used to the extra bell tolling through the night, though none of them understood why he rang it, or dared to ask. Some had started avoiding the shrine room in the early hours, unsettled by the sight of him kneeling there each dawn, thinner each season, his eyes fixed on the little flame, as though it alone stood between the monastery and ruin. One evening, the old gardener monk, Teacher Song, found Jian sitting outside the shrine long after the evening bell, his prayer beads worn smooth from constant turning. "You have been protecting this monastery for 3 years," Teacher Song said, settling onto the step beside him. "Tell me, has your praying ever once stopped a drought before it started?" Jian considered this. "I don't know. Perhaps the droughts that would have come were prevented. Or perhaps they were never coming at all," Teacher Song said, "and you have simply been exhausting yourself against a danger that existed only in your own mind." He nodded toward the temple bell, dark and silent now against the evening sky. "When I first came here, 40 years ago, there was another young monk who rang that same bell the way you do now, certain that his fear was the only thing holding back disaster. He rang it so often, so hard, night after night, that the bronze finally cracked down one side. It could not be rung at all for an entire season while a new one was cast." "What happened during that season?" Jian asked, his voice quieter now. "Nothing happened," Teacher Song said. "No drought, no bandits, no sickness. It was, in fact, the most peaceful season this monastery had seen in years, because for once, no one was awake half the night, dreading what the silence might mean." Jian looked down at the prayer beads in his hands, turning them slowly, as though seeing them for the first time. Then what was I protecting us from? All this time, nothing that was ever real, Teacher Song said gently. Only the feeling of not having done enough. That feeling will drink every hour you offer it and still ask for more. It has no bottom. He rose, brushing off his robe. Ring the bell when it is time to ring the bell. Pray when your heart wants to pray, not when your fear demands it. The monastery was never being kept safe by your exhaustion. It was only being kept from your rest. And if something does happen, Jian asked, some real danger, after I have stopped ringing the extra bell, will it not be my fault for having finally rested? If a real danger comes, Teacher Song said, you will meet it with rested hands and a clear mind, which will serve this monastery far better than a bell-rung roar with fear ever could. Exhaustion has never once made anyone more capable of facing what actually arrives. It only spends, in advance, the strength you will need when something real finally does. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Jian did not light the extra lamp before the shrine. He lay in the dark, half expecting some disaster to announce itself in the stillness his fear had always filled. None came. Only sleep came, deep and unbroken. And in the morning the monastery was exactly as it always had been. The mountain mist settling over the roof tiles, the same as every other day. Disaster, no closer and no further away than it had ever truly been. What Zhen could not have known was that his fear was not unique to monasteries or mountains. It takes other shapes in other lives, some quieter, some carried not in prayer but in the hands, folded away in trunks and chests, waiting for a winter that never quite arrives on its own terms. Half a world and several centuries away, in a small weaving village along a river in old Vietnam, a widow named Lien kept a similar kind of watch, though hers was made of cloth instead of prayer. Her loom sat by the single window of her home, and through the cold months the river fog crept in under the door each evening, damp and grey, settling into the corners of the small room she shared with her daughter. The smell of raw cotton and river damp mixed together in that house, the way incense mixed with stone in Jian's shrine. And Lien wove some of the finest cotton in the village, thread by patient thread, her fingers cracked from the cold by midwinter. Every length she finished went straight into a heavy wooden chest in the corner of her home, folded carefully, never touched again. She told herself she was saving it for hard times, for the year the harvest might fail, for the illness that might come, for whatever disaster the future was surely holding in reserve for her and her daughter. Meanwhile, the two of them slept under a single thin blanket each winter, shivering through the coldest nights, while the chest sat heavy and full only a few feet away, its wood dark with age, its contents worth more than anything else in the house. One bitter evening, her daughter Mai, no older than 8, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and asked, "Mother, why are we cold when the chest is so full?" "We are saving it," Lien said, "for when things get truly hard." "Are things not hard now?" Mai asked. "My hands are cold. Yours are cold too." Lien opened her mouth to answer and found, for the first time, that she had no real answer to give. "I suppose I have been waiting for a day worse than this one," she admitted slowly, "before I would let myself use what we have." But what if that day never comes? Mai asked. Won't we have stayed cold this whole time for nothing? Lian sat with that question longer than she expected to. She thought of every length of cloth folded in that chest, each one representing a night she had chosen fear over comfort, safety over living. The cloth had been waiting so long to become something useful that it had never once been anything at all beyond a promise she kept making to a disaster that had not yet arrived and might never arrive in the shape she feared. That night, for the first time in years, Lean opened the chest and drew out enough cloth to make a second blanket, thick and warm, and wrapped it around her daughter's shoulders herself, her hands moving over fabric she had not touched in longer than she could remember. Mai looked up at her, startled and pleased, and asked in a small voice, "Is this allowed?" "Tonight it is," Lian said, and found, to her own surprise, that saying it out loud made it feel true. In the weeks that followed, she began, slowly, to use what she had made rather than simply keep it, selling some at fair market prices, gifting some to neighbors whose own winters had turned hard, wearing the rest herself without apology. The chest did not empty all at once, and some part of her still flinched each time she lifted the lid. But the flinching grew a little smaller each time, the way a held breath eventually has to be let out. What Jian and Lian were each protecting, it turns out, was never the monastery or the future winter at all. It was a private terror that if they ever stopped suffering in advance, the world would somehow punish them for their carelessness. One paid this terror in prayers and sleepless bells, kneeling on cold stone until his knees forgot what it felt like to stand without pain. The other paid it in cold nights and folded cloth, watching her daughter shiver a few feet from a chest that could have warmed them both 100 times over. Both discovered, in their own quiet way, that the disaster they were guarding against was never made less likely by their suffering. It was only made more certain, in a smaller and crueler form, delivered daily, by their own hands. This is what worry so often mistakes itself for preparation. Real preparation is a single, clear action taken toward an actual need. Worry is the same fear, repeated endlessly, dressed up as diligence. A prayer said once, with intention, is different from a prayer said 40 times from dread. A length of cloth saved for a genuine coming winter is different from an entire chest hoarded against every winter that might ever come, real or imagined, now or in some distant, unspecified future that never quite arrives on schedule. You are allowed to prepare for tomorrow without punishing yourself tonight for it. Let that settle for a moment. The way Lian's blanket settled around her daughter's shoulders, warm before either of them had fully decided to allow it. Feel whatever you have been quietly saving against some imagined worst day. Whatever comfort you have been rationing out of fear rather than need, you do not have to keep it folded away tonight. Let your body take just a little more warmth than it thinks it has permission for. A slightly deeper breath, a slightly looser hold on the blanket or the sheets around you now. Let your hands unclench from whatever they have been quietly holding onto. Palms opening against the mattress, fingers heavy and still. Nothing terrible is waiting on the other side of this small comfort. It never was. Let your breathing settle into its own slow rhythm, without your fear standing guard over it. In, and a longer, gentler out. The bell does not need to be rung tonight. The chest does not need to stay closed. Whatever tomorrow asks of you, it will not ask more, because you allowed yourself one warm, unguarded night tonight. The flinch had grown smaller in Lian's hands, and somewhere in that same quiet unfolding was another truth waiting, about a different kind of held breath, not held in the hands this time, but in the mind, rehearsed over and over in the dark, long before anyone else has spoken a single word. There is a particular kind of exhausting conversation that happens entirely alone. You lie in bed and argue with someone who is not in the room. You explain yourself to a person who has not yet accused you of anything. You defend a decision no one has questioned. Deliver a speech no one has asked to hear. Win an argument that has not happened and may never happen at all. Perhaps it is the difficult phone call you are dreading tomorrow, rehearsed a dozen different ways before you have even dialed. Perhaps it is the conversation with a boss, a parent, a partner, replayed and rewritten each night until the actual words, when they finally arrive, feel almost beside the point. By the time you finally do speak with the person, if you ever do, the real conversation rarely follows the script you spent so many nights perfecting. And yet the mind keeps rehearsing, certain that if it only prepares thoroughly enough, it can control how the moment unfolds, as though enough imagined suffering now could somehow purchase safety later. The Buddhist teaching on the nature of thought says that the mind, left unwatched, will often mistake its own imaginings for reality, building entire arguments and outcomes out of nothing but fear, then suffering through them as though they had actually occurred. Long ago, in a Chan monastery high in the mountains of Song Dynasty, China, a young monk learned this from an elder who found him arguing with the dark. Ren had been given a difficult task. In 10 days, he was to walk down the mountain to the neighboring monastery and settle a dispute over the boundary stream that ran between the two properties. A dispute that had turned bitter over the past year, with accusations passed back and forth by messenger, each letter sharper than the last. Ren had never met the monks on the other side, only heard of their sharp tongues and their abbot's short temper. Second-hand stories carried up the mountain by traders and pilgrims passing through in the autumn months. Each version a little worse than the one before. Each retelling adding some new cruelty that may never have actually been spoken. From the moment the task was given to him, his mind had not stopped preparing for battle. Each night, after the last bell had rung and the monastery had settled into its familiar creaking silence, the halls quiet and cold under the mountain sky, Ren sat alone in his small room with a single candle burning low on the table, its light casting long, moving shadows across the plaster walls, the smell of hot wax thick in the closed air of the room. There, in the flickering half-dark, he rehearsed. He imagined the other monastery's abbot accusing his own of stealing water. He composed, word for word, the calm and devastating reply he would give. He imagined the accusation taking a different shape and composed a different reply. He imagined being shouted at and practiced not flinching. He imagined being mocked for his youth and practiced a response that would silence the room. Night after night, the candle burned down while Ren built an entire mountain range of arguments that no one but he would ever hear, his lips sometimes moving without sound, sometimes not. By the 7th night, Ren's eyes had gone hollow, and his voice, when he spoke to the other monks during the day, had grown strange and distracted, as though part of him were always somewhere else, still rehearsing. He had begun mixing up which argument belonged to which imagined version of the confrontation, forgetting halfway through a rehearsed reply whether he was answering the accusation about the water or the one about the boundary stones. The many scripts blurring together into one long, exhausting performance with no audience but himself. He ate less. He answered questions from his fellow monks a beat too late, as though translating from some other conversation happening only in his own skull. On the 8th night, the elder monk, Fen, passed by Ren's door and heard him muttering, low and urgent, to no one. He pushed the door open and found Ren sitting bolt upright before his candle, mid-argument with the empty air. "Who are you speaking to?" Fen asked. Ren startled, embarrassed. "No one, teacher. I am only preparing for what I will say when I go down the mountain." "Preparing what exactly?" Fen asked, settling onto the floor across from him. "Everything," Ren said. "What their abbot might say, what I will answer, what he might say after that. I want to be ready for whatever happens." Fen was quiet for a moment, watching the candle flame bend and straighten in the small draft from the door. "Tell me," he said, "in all your nights of rehearsing, has the conversation you imagined ever once matched the conversation that actually happened? In any dispute you have ever had in your life?" Ren opened his mouth to answer, and found, to his own surprise, that he could not remember a single time it had. Every argument he had ever braced for had arrived differently than he expected, taken some turn he had not rehearsed, required words he had not prepared. The scripts had always been useless, and yet he kept writing new ones anyway. "Then what have you actually been preparing for?" Fen asked. "I don't know," Ren admitted quietly. "Only preparing, I suppose, against the fear of not being ready." Fen nodded, as though this were exactly the answer he expected. "There is a stream at the bottom of this mountain," he said. "The very one you are being sent to argue about. Have you ever noticed that it never runs the same path twice? Not from one season to the next. Not even from one rainfall to the next. Rain falls. Stones shift. The bank crumbles a little here and builds a little there, and the water simply finds whatever way is open to it in that moment. It does not rehearse its route the night before. It cannot, because the path has not been decided yet, and neither has your conversation. You are trying to memorize the course of a river before the rain has even fallen." "But how will I know what to say?" Ren asked. "If I don't prepare, you will know when you are standing there, in front of an actual person, saying actual words, responding calmly to what is actually said, rather than to a version of them you built alone in the dark." Fen said, "The mind you bring to a real moment, rested and open, will serve you better than 100 imagined arguments ever could. Right now you are not preparing. You are suffering through 10 separate disputes that have not happened, one new invention every night. And by the time the real conversation finally arrives, you will be too exhausted from all the false ones to meet it well. So I should think about nothing at all," Ren said, uncertain, "and simply walk down the mountain unprepared, with an empty mind and nothing rehearsed. There is a difference between preparing your heart and rehearsing your fear," Fen said calmly. "Prepare your heart Remember why you are going, what you hope for, both monasteries, what kindness might sound like if you are given the chance to offer it. That takes a few honest minutes, not 10 sleepless nights of imagined battle. Ren looked at the candle, burned now to barely a stub, wax pooled thick around its base from so many nights of late, restless burning. He thought of every argument he had rehearsed and discarded, every version of a stranger's face he had built out of nothing but dread and second-hand rumor, and felt, for the first time in 8 nights, the particular exhaustion of it settle fully into his shoulders. "Blow it out," Fen said gently, nodding at the candle. "Let tonight be the first night in over a week that you go to sleep without arguing with someone who is not here." Ren did. He sat a moment in the dark that followed, strange and unfamiliar after so many nights of rehearsal. And then, for the first time since the task was given to him, he lay down and slept without a single imagined voice waiting for him in the dark. When the day finally came to walk down the mountain, Ren went with an unrehearsed mind. The path underfoot, cold and familiar, the morning air sharp against his face. In a way, it had not seemed in weeks of sleepless nights. The conversation that followed matched none of the 100 versions he had built and discarded in the weeks before. It was shorter than he expected, and quieter, and the other abbot, it turned out, was not nearly as sharp-tongued as his reputation suggested. Only tired, and worried about the same water in the same way Ren's own monastery was. They settled the matter in less time than Ren had once spent rehearsing a single one of his imagined arguments, and he walked back up the mountain that evening with his mind, for once, entirely quiet. The stream beside the path, moving in a course it had never taken the evening before, and would not take again the evening after. He had spent 40 nights defending himself against people who were not there, arguing with versions of them that existed nowhere except behind his own eyes. And not one of those nights had made the real conversation, when it finally came, any easier to have. What Ren discovered, sitting in the ash and cooling wax of his own burned-down candle, was something worth sitting with tonight. The mind believes that rehearsing pain in advance is a form of control, a way of softening the blow before it lands. But the blow it rehearses almost never lands the way it imagined, and so it has spent its strength defending against a danger that was never quite real, leaving less strength behind for whatever actually arrives. There is a particular cruelty in this that is easy to miss. The imagined argument feels so real while it is happening. The imagined accusation stings as though it had actually been spoken, and the body responds to all of it. The tight chest, the racing heart, the clenched jaw, exactly as it would to a real threat. You suffer the full weight of a conversation that has not occurred, sometimes many times over, composing new versions each night as though the previous 99 attempts had simply not been thorough enough. Notice the arguments you may be having tonight with someone who is not in the room, the conversation you are composing for tomorrow, word for word, as though rehearsal could guarantee an outcome. The reply you have already prepared for an accusation no one has made. This is not preparation. It is suffering, borrowed early, spent on a version of the future that has not been written yet, and, in all likelihood, never will be written exactly the way you fear. The stream does not know its path until the water is already moving. You do not have to write tomorrow's conversation tonight. Let whatever imagined voice has been speaking to you in the dark. Go quiet now. Let the room around you be as empty and unrehearsed as it actually is. No one accusing you of anything. No one waiting to be answered. Feel your jaw loosen. The muscles around your mouth releasing words they were not actually being asked to say. Feel the tightness in your chest ease. Just slightly. The way it does when an argument you were bracing for simply never comes. Your breath does not need a script either. Let it come and let it go without needing to know what it is preparing you for. There is no one on the other side of tonight's silence waiting for your reply. And somewhere further down the mountain, past the argument that never needed rehearsing, another fear was still waiting to be looked at more closely tonight. Quieter than the voices in the dark. Harder to argue your way out of because it does not announce itself in words at all. It is the fear that even with the clearest mind and the calmest words, there might still not be enough. Not enough time. Not enough strength. Not enough of whatever it is that makes a person feel truly, lastingly safe. And somewhere past the argument that never needed rehearsing, another fear was still waiting, quieter than the voices in the dark, one that does not ask you to defend yourself against a person at all, but against a future in which there is simply not enough. No matter how carefully you have counted and recounted what you already hold, there is a particular ache that has nothing to do with actual hunger or actual danger. It is the feeling that no matter how much you have gathered, saved, earned, or secured, it will not be sufficient when the real trouble comes. Perhaps you check a balance you already know the number of. Perhaps you deny yourself small comforts you could easily afford, telling yourself you are being responsible, when really you are simply afraid. Perhaps it shows up as a reluctance to take a day off, a discomfort with spending on anything that is not strictly necessary, a habit of measuring every purchase against some imagined future emergency that has not arrived and may never arrive in the shape you have prepared for. Perhaps you measure your worth by how much cushion stands between you and disaster, and no cushion, no matter how thick, ever quite feels thick enough. This fear rarely announces itself as fear. It wears the clothing of practicality, of discipline, of simply being careful, and so it is one of the hardest kinds to recognize, let alone set down, because it so often looks, from the outside, like nothing more than good sense. The Buddhist teaching on craving says that the mind's hunger for security is a particular kind of grasping, one that can never be fully satisfied by accumulation alone, because the hunger was never really about the amount in the first place, only about the fear underneath it, which no quantity of anything has ever managed to fully quiet. Long ago, in a small village beside a river in Gupta-era India, a potter learned this from a fire that burned the same whether his shelves were empty or full. And in a convent in Jin Dynasty China, a nun named Lingzong discovered something even stranger, that a hand held open could feel less afraid than a hand held closed. Manu had been a potter for 20 years, and for most of those years, he had told himself the same quiet story that he had not yet made enough. Not enough pots, not enough coin, not enough distance between his family and whatever hardship might be waiting further down the road of their lives. He rose before the sun each morning to knead the clay, the wet earth cool and heavy under his palms in the grey half-light, and worked long after the other potters in the village had gone home to their suppers, the kiln fire glowing orange against the growing dark, its heat pressing against his face as he fed it wood long past the hour it needed feeding. The smell of wood smoke and baked clay, thick in the humid evening air along the river. His shelves, by the time the rains came each year, were already crowded 3 rows deep, with pots he had not sold, dust gathering on the ones at the back. But still, he rose the next morning and began again, certain that the moment he stopped, disaster would find the gap he had left open. His wife had stopped asking him to rest years ago. His children had grown used to a father who ate his evening meal standing at the kiln, still working, his hands never quite still, flecked always with dried clay, even at the dinner table. The villagers spoke of him as the hardest working potter along the river, and Manu had come to wear this reputation the way another man might wear a wound, proud of it and exhausted by it in equal measure. Unable to remember anymore whether the work was for his family or simply against the fear itself, the two having blurred together somewhere in the middle years of his life until he could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. One evening, an old wandering monk passed through the village and stopped to watch Manu feeding the kiln long after dusk, the fire's light moving across his tired face. "Your shelves are already full," the monk observed. "Why do you keep making more? There is never enough," Manu said, not looking up from the fire. "You cannot know what next season will bring." The monk walked slowly along the crowded shelves, running a finger through the dust that had settled on the pots in the back rows, pots that had sat untouched for what looked like years. How many of these would be enough? If you allowed yourself to believe it, he asked. 100, 1,000, tell me the number, and I will help you count toward it. Manu opened his mouth to answer and found, to his own quiet horror, that he did not have a number. There had never been a number. There had only ever been more. "The fire burns exactly as hot," the monk said gently, "whether it is warming a full shelf or an empty one. It does not know the difference, and it does not care. Only you have decided that the fullness of your shelves has anything to do with whether you are safe tonight." He looked at Manu's hands, cracked and calloused, far beyond what the work alone required. "What are you actually trying to feed with all of this? If it was never truly the kiln?" Manu looked at his shelves, really looked at them. The crowded rows of pots no one in the village could ever possibly need, and felt something in his chest that had been clenched for 20 years loosen, just slightly, like a fist finally allowed to open. That night, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he banked the kiln fire early and sat down to supper with his family while the food was still warm. Tasting the rice and lentils properly for what felt like the first time in years, listening to his children talk about their day without half his mind, still counting pots in the dark outside. The next morning, he carried 3 of the dust-covered pots from the back shelf to a neighbor whose own had cracked in the winter cold, and gave them away without asking for anything in return, and felt, standing in his neighbor's doorway with empty hands, a strange and unfamiliar lightness that no amount of saved coin had ever once given him. Manu's fear had worn the shape of unsold pots and an ever-growing shelf. In other lives, in other centuries, the same fear takes other shapes entirely, sometimes stranger, sometimes harder to recognize, sometimes carried not by someone hoarding too much, but by someone who has learned, almost by accident, to carry almost nothing at all. Half a world away, and a century earlier, in a convent beside the Yellow River, A nun named Lingzong had found her way to something similar, though her road there had been harder than Manu's. Lingzong had survived bandits twice in her early life, once escaping by a strange and desperate ploy, plucking out her own eyebrows to appear disfigured by illness, so the bandits would leave her untouched, and crossed a dangerous river current by what her followers would later call a small miracle, a white deer appearing to guide her safely to the far bank. She had given her life afterward to the Western nunnery in Siju, known for her learning and her faith. Respected enough that even the emperor of the time had sent letters conveying his esteem for her. But when an epidemic swept through the region, leaving the poor and the displaced without food or shelter in the aftermath of a fallen dynasty, Lingzong did not turn to the convent stores or wait for donations from the wealthy. She walked out onto the road herself, again and again, in the plain robes of a beggar, gathering rice and coin from strangers, one small offering at a time, carrying it back to feed people who had nothing at all, her own robes growing as thin and worn as theirs. A young follower once asked her why she did not simply ask the convent for what was needed, rather than begging on the road like someone with nothing of her own. Because I have learned something on that road that I could not learn inside these walls, Lingzong said. When I hold my bowl out empty, people fill it. When I keep my hands closed around what I already have, they stay empty in every way that matters. But are you not afraid, the follower asked, of having nothing left for yourself? I have never once had nothing, Lingzong said. I have only ever had exactly enough for what the next hour required of me, which is a different thing entirely from having enough saved against every hour that might ever come. She continued this way for years, walking the roads as a beggar, not because she lacked resources, but because she had discovered that her own sense of scarcity dissolved each time she gave rather than gathered, that the fear of not having enough could not survive very long inside a hand that kept opening instead of closing. The villagers along her route came to know her by sight. This thin, plainly dressed nun with the calm eyes, who asked for almost nothing and gave away everything she was given within the same day, sometimes the same hour, as though holding on to anything longer than necessary made her uneasy in a way that having nothing never did. What Manu and Lingzong each discovered, from opposite corners of the old Buddhist world, was the same quiet turn. The fear of not having enough is rarely cured by having more. It is loosened, instead, by the smaller, stranger act of giving something away and finding, afterward, that you are still standing, still breathing, still entirely intact. Manu's shelves did not grow lighter because he sold more pots. They grew lighter because he finally let a few of them go. Lingzong's bowl was never full when she carried it, and somehow she was the least afraid person for 100 miles in any direction, walking roads that frightened even armed travelers, carrying nothing that anyone could take from her because she had already given away anything worth taking. This does not mean the fear you carry about money or security is foolish, or that real needs are not real. Manu still needed to sell pots to feed his family, and Lingzong still needed the rice and coin she gathered to feed the sick. Neither story asks you to abandon caution or to give away what you actually need. It means the particular ache of never enough often has very little to do with the actual number in your hand, and everything to do with a much older fear that has simply borrowed the shape of coins and shelves and savings to make itself easier to name, easier to chase, easier to mistake for a problem that more accumulation could ever actually solve. The fear was never really about pots or coins or rice. It was only ever about whether you would be safe. And safety, it turns out, was never something either of them could fully purchase in advance. She had discovered, somewhere on the long road as a beggar, that a bowl held out empty could fill faster than a chest kept locked. You are allowed to notice what you already have tonight, rather than only what you fear you might someday lack. Let your hands, wherever they are resting right now, soften their grip on whatever they have been quietly holding on to, whether that is a number, a possession, or simply the tight and tiring belief that there is not yet enough. Let your shoulders drop a little further from your ears, the way a hand finally uncurls after holding something clenched for far too long. Feel your chest rise and fall, unhurried, needing nothing further from you tonight than this single, ordinary breath. There is no shelf to fill tonight, no chest to lock, no number to reach before you are allowed to rest. The kiln fire burns the same whether the shelf is crowded or bare. You do not have to keep feeding it out of fear tonight. And somewhere beyond even this fear, in the deeper hours still ahead, another old habit was waiting to be looked at closely, quieter still than the fear of scarcity, and in some ways older. It is the quiet belief that if we only worry hard enough, carefully enough, long enough, we might finally gain some real control over the things that were never ours to control in the first place. A belief that does not ask what you have, but what you can prevent, simply by refusing to look away from it. And somewhere beyond the fear of never having enough, another old habit was waiting in the dark, quieter still, the belief that worry itself might hold some real power over the things we cannot actually touch. There is a particular kind of magical thinking that most of us would never call by that name. It is the sense that if we worry hard enough about something, we are somehow participating in its outcome, that our anxious attention is a kind of offering that might tip the balance towards safety. You may have felt it yourself, staying awake over a sick relative in another city, as though your wakefulness could reach across the distance and help. Or replaying tomorrow's difficult meeting so many times that some part of you believes the rehearsal itself might change how it goes. Perhaps it shows up as refusing to relax during someone else's flight until you know they have landed safely. Or feeling that if you allow yourself to enjoy an ordinary evening while someone you love is struggling, you are somehow betraying them, as though your discomfort were doing them some quiet service across the distance. It rarely survives being said aloud. Spoken plainly, it sounds almost foolish, and yet the body keeps performing it anyway, holding its breath, holding its vigil, as though letting go of the worry might be the one thing that finally lets the disaster in. The Buddhist teaching on non-attachment says something quieter and stranger than most people expect. It says that outcomes are shaped by causes and conditions already in motion, not by how tightly the mind grips them afterward, and that our grip changes nothing about the world except how tired we become while holding it. The storm does not check who is watching before it decides how hard to blow. Long ago, in a mountain monastery in Kamakura-era Japan, two monks discovered this in 2 different seasons, in 2 entirely different ways, and only one of them found any peace in the discovery. In the season of typhoons, the monastery's ancient plum tree, said to be 200 years old and older than the temple itself, stood exposed on the ridge above the main hall, its bark silvered and cracked with age, its branches twisted into shapes that spoke of countless winds already survived, and its care had been given to a young monk named Tetsu. When the first great storm of the season rolled in off the coast, the sky going the color of old iron and the wind arriving first as a low moan through the valley below, Tetsu became convinced that the tree's survival depended entirely on him. He sat beneath it through the worst of the wind and rain, night after night, soaked through, gripping its lowest branch as though his own hands could somehow steady 200 years of ancient wood against the storm, certain that if he ever once let himself sleep, the tree would fall, and it would be his fault alone. By the third storm of the season, Tetsu had grown gaunt and hollow-eyed, his robes never fully dry, his hands raw from gripping wet bark through hour after hour of driving rain, the skin along his palms split and stinging with every fresh gust. The other monks had begun to worry for him more than for the tree, watching him stumble through his daytime duties, half asleep on his feet, muttering apologies to the plum tree each time the wind picked up again, as though the tree itself could hear and might hold his devotion against him if he ever stopped. One evening, the monastery's abbot, Genko, found Tetsu already soaked and shivering beneath the tree hours before the storm had even fully arrived, the first fat drops of rain just beginning to darken the stones of the courtyard, and sat down on the wet ground beside him without a word, his own robes slowly soaking through as well. "How many storms has this tree survived?" Genko finally asked. "In the 200 years before you were born to guard it." Tetsu considered this. "I don't know, teacher. Many, I suppose." "And in all those storms," Genko said, "how many nights did it have a monk sitting beneath it, holding its branch through the wind?" Tetsu had no answer. He had never once considered that the tree had survived 2 centuries of typhoons entirely without him. The next storm came 3 nights later, and Genko asked Tetsu to sleep in his own bed instead, and to trust that his exhausted vigil had never once been the thing keeping the tree standing. Tetsu lay awake most of that first night anyway, straining to hear the wind through the thin walls of his room, certain some catastrophe was unfolding without him, his body rigid beneath the blankets in a posture that offered no real rest at all. In the grey hour before dawn, unable to bear it any longer, he finally went out to check, half expecting to find the ancient trunk split and fallen, his bare feet cold against the wet stones of the courtyard. The tree stood exactly as it always had, its old branches bent and dripping but whole, having weathered the storm the same way it had weathered every storm before Tetsu was born, and would likely weather every storm after he was gone. Rainwater still dripped steadily from its lowest branches, the same branch he had gripped so many nights before, and in the pale early light it looked, for the first time since the season began, simply like a tree, ordinary and unbothered, rather than a fragile thing balanced on the edge of his vigilance. The tree had survived every storm in its 200 years without once needing a single sleepless witness, and Tetsu had simply been the latest to forget this. Tetsu's fear had worn the shape of a wet branch gripped through the dark. In the season that followed, a different monk faced a different threat, and chose, from the very beginning, a different way of carrying it. The following season, when the rains failed to come and a hard drought settled over the mountain, the earth cracking in pale grey lines across the temple's rice fields, the fields were given into the care of another young monk, Kaze, who had watched Tetsu's exhausted vigil the year before and had quietly decided he would not repeat it. Kays worked hard during the drought. There was no shortcut around that. He walked the long distance to the river each morning to carry water to the young rice shoots, the buckets heavy and biting into his shoulders on the return climb. Dug new channels to catch what little rain did fall. Asked the village below for help clearing an old irrigation ditch that had silted over years before. Spending whole afternoons, knee-deep in mud and dry silt, alongside the villagers who came to help. He did everything a careful farmer or gardener could reasonably do. His hands blistered from the shovel, his skin browned and dried by long days under a merciless sun. But when evening came, he stopped. He ate his meal, sat a while in the cooling air, watching the last light drain from the ridge where Tetsu's plum tree stood green and unbothered, and slept. The other monks, remembering Tetsu, were baffled by this. One evening, Genko found Kazi already settling in for sleep, despite the rice field standing parched and yellowing in the last of the daylight. The whole mountainside, dry and dust-colored under a sky, still stubbornly cloudless, and asked him plainly why he did not sit up worrying the way Tetsu once had. Because worrying has never once watered a field. Not in all the years I have tended one. Kaze said simply, I have already done what my hands can do today. What is left belongs to the sky, and the sky has never once asked my permission for rain. But are you not afraid the harvest will fail entirely? Ginkgo asked. While you sleep so soundly through it, I might be afraid. Kaze admitted, and I can be afraid and still sleep. The fear does not need my wakefulness to keep it company. It will still be there in the morning either way, and I would rather meet it rested than exhausted. The drought broke 10 days later than anyone would have liked, and the harvest that year was smaller than usual, but far from ruined. Saved in large part by the channels Kaze had dug and the water he had carried each morning with his own 2 hands. Hands that had rested every single night, rather than gripping anything through the dark. Kazi had done everything the drought asked of him. And then, unlike Tetsu, he had done the one thing his fear never could. He had stopped. Tetsu, hearing of this the following year, understood something at last, that Genko's quiet question about the plum tree had only begun to open in him. His storms had never once been made safer by his sleeplessness. Kazi's drought had never once been eased by anxious watching. What changed outcomes was the clear-eyed work done in daylight. The channels dug, the water carried, the branch that needed no human hand to hold it through the wind. What worry added, in both cases, was only exhaustion, offered up to a danger that was never listening in the first place. This is difficult to hear, because worry so often feels like love, like devotion, like the very least we can offer to the things and people we are afraid of losing. To stop worrying can feel, in the moment, like a kind of abandonment, as though caring and suffering were the same act, wearing different clothes. But the tree did not need Tetsu's vigil, and the field was not saved by Kaze's fear. It was saved by his hands, by daylight, by work done and then set down. The mind wants desperately to believe that its anxious attention is doing something, that the sheer intensity of its watching is itself a form of protection extended outward into the world. Mostly, it is only doing something to the mind, wearing it thin one sleepless hour at a time, leaving less of it available for the actual work that might have helped. There is a kind of care that looks like Tetsu's, gripping and sleepless and visibly suffering. Easy to mistake for the deepest form of love, simply because it costs so much. And there is a kind of care that looks like Casey's, quiet and rested, and easy to mistake for indifference simply because it costs so little. Only one of them left anything left over for the next morning's work. Notice what you have been holding vigil over tonight, gripping tightly, the way Tetsu gripped that wet, splintering branch, certain that your sleeplessness is somehow required, somehow load-bearing, somehow the one thing standing between calm and catastrophe. Whatever it is, it has likely survived a great many nights already, without your wakefulness standing guard over it. The way the plum tree survived 2 centuries of storms before Tetsu was ever born to worry about it. You have already done. Today, whatever your hands could reasonably do. The rest belongs to something larger than your vigilance. The weather, the outcome, the slow turning of circumstances that were never actually waiting for your permission to unfold one way or another. Let your grip loosen now, the way Tetsu's finally did, finger by finger, on whatever wet branch you have been holding through tonight's storm. Feel your body sink a little heavier into the bed beneath you, no longer needing to brace against a wind that was never actually going to be stopped by your bracing. Let your shoulders remember the particular relief of Casey's evenings. Work finished, hands still, nothing left to do but rest. The mountain, dark, settling gently around him, the way it settles around you now. Let your breath come slow and easy, the way Casey's did on the nights the field stood parched beneath a sky that had not yet decided to rain, trusting that morning would still find him rested enough to carry water again if the water was still needed. And somewhere further into the quiet, deepening night, a different kind of fear was still waiting to be looked at closely. One that lives not in gardens or storms, but in the body itself. The quiet dread of losing control over the very flesh and breath that carry us through each day. It does not ask for channels dug or branches held. It asks something else entirely, something no amount of watching, in the end, has ever once been able to prevent. And somewhere further into the quiet, deepening night, a different kind of fear had been waiting. One that does not live in gardens or storms, but in the body itself. The flesh and breath that carry us through each ordinary day. Patient and unglamorous, and easy to take entirely for granted until it stops behaving the way we expect it to. There is a particular dread that arrives the moment we notice our own body doing something we did not authorize. A tremor that was not there last year. A new ache that appears without explanation. A moment of forgetting that lasts half a second too long. Perhaps it is the strange flutter in your chest you have started noticing at night, or the way your knees complain now on stairs that never used to bother them, or simply the creeping awareness that you cannot move through the world quite as effortlessly as you once did. In that instant, something ancient in us panics, certain that the body has begun to slip out of our hands entirely, that unless we grip it tightly enough, watch it closely enough, will it to behave through sheer force of attention, it will simply keep drifting further away from our control. This fear rarely announces itself calmly. It arrives instead as a private, quiet terror. The sense that safety has always depended on a body that obeys, and that a body which no longer obeys has somehow betrayed us. The Buddhist teaching on the nature of the body says something gentler than this fear expects. It says the body was never a possession to be controlled in the first place, only a process to be lived alongside. changing by its own nature, the way weather changes, the way rivers change, whether or not the mind approves or resists. Long ago, in a village high in the Tibetan mountains, during the years when scholars were carrying medical wisdom across the passes from India, translating ancient texts by lamplight in cold monastery libraries, a healer named Yeshe learned this from her own trembling hands. Yeshe had tended the sick of her village for nearly 30 years, known for the steadiness of her touch when she read a patient's pulse, 3 fingers pressed lightly against the wrist, listening for the particular rhythm that would tell her what medicine to prepare. The small stone house, always smelling faintly of dried herbs, and the butter lamp she kept burning by her work table through the long winter evenings. Her hands had always been sure, patient, unhurried. The same hands that ground herbs into powder and measured tinctures by careful eye in the low light of her small stone house. The mountain wind rattling the shutters while she worked long past when her neighbors had gone to sleep. That steadiness had become, over the years, the very thing she believed her healing depended on, the foundation beneath every diagnosis she had ever made. In her 53rd winter, after decades of steady, unremarkable service to her village, Yeshe noticed her right hand had begun, faintly at first, to tremble. It came and went without pattern, worse in the cold mornings, worse still when she was tired or afraid. And the more she noticed it, the more she found herself watching for it, bracing against it, willing it to stop through sheer concentration each time she sat beside a patient's bed. She began keeping her hand tucked against her body when it was not needed, hiding it in the folds of her heavy wool robe, ashamed of it in a way she had never once been ashamed of anything about her own body before. She began turning patients away on her worst days, terrified that a shaking hand might mistake one pulse for another, might measure the wrong dose, might undo in a moment of weakness everything 30 years of steady care had built. By midwinter, Yeshe had stopped treating patients almost entirely, sitting alone in her stone house instead, staring at her own hand as though it were an enemy that had taken up residence at the end of her arm, gripping one hand with the other in a futile attempt to hold it still by force, her knuckles white with the effort, the butter lamp guttering low on the table beside her as the hours passed unmarked. Word spread through the village that the healer had grown strange, reclusive, unwilling to see even the mildest complaints, and children who had once run to her door now hurried past it instead, glancing up nervously at the shuttered windows. And still Yeshe sat with her hand clenched inside the other, as though enough willpower might yet undo what her body had already decided on its own. One evening, her old teacher, Lobsang, now blind and long retired from healing himself, made the difficult walk up to her door through the fresh snow, guided by his grandson's steady arm, his breath coming in, visible clouds in the frozen air, and sat with her by the fire, the warmth slowly returning to his weathered face. "I hear you have stopped seeing patients," he said, settling slowly onto the low stool beside her hearth. "My hand shakes," Yeshe said, holding it out toward the fire, watching it tremble faintly in the flickering light. "I cannot trust it anymore. I do not know how to heal anyone if I cannot even trust my own hand." Lobsang reached out and took her trembling hand in his own 2 steady ones. His fingers, though unable to see, finding her pulse point with the same old familiarity he had once used to teach her this very skill decades before. "Tell me," he said, his voice calm and unhurried by the fire. In 30 years of reading pulses, did you ever once feel a pulse that stayed perfectly still beneath your fingers? Yeshi considered this carefully, surprised by the simplicity of the question. No, she admitted slowly. A pulse that does not move at all is a pulse belonging to the dead. Then, what have you actually spent 30 years listening for? Lobsang asked, still holding her hand gently between his own. Not stillness. Movement. Change. The particular way a living body never once holds steady and tells you everything true about itself precisely because it does not. He set her hand down gently, patting it once. Your own hand has simply joined the conversation now, trembling the way every pulse you have ever read has trembled, telling you something true about a body that was never meant to hold perfectly still in the first place. Yeshi looked down at her hand, still shaking faintly in the firelight, the shadows it cast, trembling too against the stone wall behind her, and felt something in her chest loosen that had been clenched since the first cold morning she noticed the tremor. She thought of every pulse she had ever pressed her fingers against, none of them ever fully at rest, all of them moving, changing, alive precisely because they refused to be still, and understood, for the first time, that she had spent 30 years honoring exactly the quality in others that she had spent this last winter fighting in herself. The following morning, for the first time in weeks, Yeshi opened her door to a patient again, a young mother worried about her infant's fever, the child small and flushed in her mother's arms, whimpering softly against the morning cold. Yeshi's hand trembled faintly as she pressed her fingers to the child's small wrist, and this time, instead of fighting the tremor, she let it tremble, listening past the shaking to the pulse beneath it, finding the rhythm she needed the same way she always had, the fever's particular quickness, distinguishable even through her own unsteady fingers. She prepared the tincture the child needed, her hand shaking the entire time she measured it, and the medicine was exactly as it should have been. Her hands had never once held the pulse still. They had only ever listened to it move, and somewhere in her fear, she had forgotten the difference. She continued her work for many more years after that winter, her hand trembling a little more with each passing season, and her patience, it turned out, trusted her only more for it, sensing perhaps that a healer who had made peace with her own unsteady body understood something true about all the unsteady bodies she was asked to tend. Mothers brought her their frightened children in the dead of night. Old men brought her their failing joints, their labored breathing, their own quiet fears about growing old. And Yeshi, hand trembling, listened to each of them the way Lobsang had taught her to listen to her own pulse that winter evening, not for stillness, but for the particular, honest movement of a body still very much alive. What Yeshi discovered beside her own fire that winter evening was not a cure for her trembling hand. The tremor never fully left her. What she found instead was the difference between a body that must be controlled and a body that can simply be listened to. A distinction that changes almost nothing about what the body actually does, and almost everything about how much suffering accompanies it. This distinction matters more than it might first appear. Control asks the body to conform to a fixed idea of how it should behave, and treats any deviation as failure, as betrayal, as something to be fought and corrected before life can safely continue. Listening asks something entirely different. It asks only to know what is actually happening, moment to moment, without demanding that it be otherwise first. Without requiring the body to earn its own acceptance through perfect behavior. A tremor met with control becomes a battle fought every single day, exhausting in a way that has nothing to do with the tremor itself and everything to do with the fighting. A tremor met with listening becomes simply one more thing the body is doing, alongside breathing, alongside the beating of the heart, neither good nor bad, only present. You may be carrying your own version of Yeshe's trembling hand tonight. Some small betrayal of the body you have been quietly fighting, bracing against, willing to behave through sheer force of attention. A change in your sleep, an ache that returns each evening. A body that no longer moves quite the way it once did, and the fear that this means something has gone wrong, that must be corrected before you can rest easy again. Perhaps you have caught yourself, more than once, holding your breath while you wait to see whether some small symptom will pass, as though your vigilance alone could hurry it along. The body was never asking to be controlled. It was only ever asking to be listened to. Let your attention rest on your own breath for a moment, not to manage it, not to perfect it, only to notice it moving the way it always has, imperfect and alive, and entirely unconcerned with your permission. Feel your heartbeat somewhere beneath your ribs, steady enough to carry you through tonight, changing its rhythm slightly with every breath, the way every living pulse has always done, quickening a little, slowing a little, never once holding perfectly still, and never once needing to. There is nothing to fix in this moment. There is only a body, doing what living bodies do, trusted a little more tonight than it was trusted yesterday. Let your hands unclench from whatever they have been gripping, the way Yeshe's finally did, resting open and unguarded against the sheets, palms soft, fingers loose. Feel whatever small tremor or ache your own body carries tonight, and instead of bracing against it, simply notice it. The way Yeshe learned to notice the pulse beneath her own shaking hand, without needing it to be anything other than exactly what it is. Whatever you have been trying to hold perfectly still tonight was likely never meant to be still in the first place. And somewhere beyond even this fear, in the quiet hours still remaining tonight, a different kind of worry was waiting. One that does not ask you to watch over your own trembling body, but over the bodies and lives of the people you love most. A fear that wears the disguise of devotion so completely that it can be almost impossible to tell where the caring ends and the fear begins, and harder still to set down, because it never once feels like fear from the inside. It feels, every time, exactly like love. And somewhere beyond even the fear of a trembling hand, in the quiet hours still remaining, a different kind of worry had been waiting all along. One that wears the disguise of devotion so completely that it can be almost impossible to tell where the caring ends and the fear begins. There is a particular ache that belongs only to loving someone whose safety you cannot actually guarantee. You may know it as the tightness in your chest when a child is late coming home, the reflexive checking of a phone for a message that has not yet arrived, the private conviction that if you simply worry hard enough about the people you love, some of that worry might reach across the distance and keep them safe. Perhaps it shows up as lying awake until you hear your teenager's key in the door, or calling a parent an extra time just to hear their voice sound steady, or feeling a strange guilt on the evenings you manage to forget, even briefly, to worry about someone you love who is far away and struggling. It feels, from the inside, exactly like love. It is easy to mistake the two, because they so often arrive together, and because the alternative, loving someone without also suffering over them, can feel almost like not loving them enough. The Buddhist teaching on compassion says something that can be difficult to hear at first. It says that true compassion for another person does not require suffering alongside their danger, only presence with their reality, and that a heart worn ragged by worry has less, not more, to offer the very people it is trying to protect. Long ago, in a mountain monastery in Goryeo-era Korea, an old teacher discovered this while his most beloved student walked a dangerous road. And centuries later, and a country away, in a fishing village on the Vietnamese coast, a father learned to carry the same understanding into every single ordinary morning of his life. Master Hyun had trained his student Jin for over a decade, watching him grow from a nervous, uncertain boy into a monk of quiet steadiness. And when the monastery was asked to carry a set of newly copied sutras across 3 mountain passes, known for bandits, to assist a temple, Hyun chose to send Jin, trusting him more than any other monk in his care. The moment Jin's small figure disappeared down the mountain path, his robes grey against the green of the pines, Hyun felt something in his chest clench tight and refused to release. He lit a lamp before the shrine that evening and did not blow it out, watching its small flame catch and hold in the cool evening air, telling himself he would keep it burning until Jin returned safely, as though the flame itself were a kind of tether holding his student to life. For each of the 7 days, Jin was expected to be gone. Hyun barely slept, imagining every turn in the mountain road where bandits might wait, every stream crossing where a foot might slip, every night camp where cold or wild animals might find a young monk traveling alone. He walked the monastery grounds late into the night, unable to settle, as though his own restlessness were somehow keeping pace with his student's danger and, by keeping pace with it, holding it at bay. On the 5th night, an elder monk named Deok found Hyun still awake by the shrine lamp, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, his robes wrinkled from days of restless pacing rather than rest. "You have not slept in 5 nights," Deok said, settling beside him. "Jin is somewhere on that mountain," Hyun said. "How could I possibly sleep?" "Has your sleeplessness moved him any faster along the road?" Deok asked quietly. "Has it warned off a single bandit, warmed a single cold night, steadied a single uncertain footstep?" Hyun opened his mouth to answer and found he had no honest reply. His worry had accompanied Jin in feeling, but not in fact. It had walked no part of the actual road. "I taught you once," Deok said gently, resting a weathered hand briefly on Hyun's shoulder, "that compassion means feeling with someone, not feeling instead of them, and certainly not suffering on their behalf, as though your suffering could be transferred to lighten theirs. Jin does not need you exhausted and hollow-eyed when he returns. He needs a teacher rested enough to actually see him, to actually hear what happened on that road, rather than a teacher so consumed by imagining his danger that there is nothing left over to meet the real, returning boy." Hyun looked at the lamp he had refused to let go out, its small flame steady, despite the long hours it had already burned, wax pooling thick around its base. Then what should I have been doing instead? All these days, The same thing you would ask any student to do. The oak said, "Trust his training. Hold him in your heart without needing to also hold your breath. Care for him without needing to suffer for him." These are not the same practice, though they wear remarkably similar clothing. That night, for the first time since Jin had left, Hyun slept, and though his heart still turned toward the mountain road each time he woke, he no longer tried to walk it alongside his student in his mind. Jin returned on the 7th day, tired but unharmed, having faced nothing more dangerous than a single steep river crossing, and found his teacher rested enough to listen fully to every detail of the road, rather than too exhausted from imagined dangers to hear the real one. Hyun had spent the boy's entire time away walking a road only he could see, and none of his steps had shortened the real one by even a single pace. What Hyun learned in a single hard week, tested all at once by a single dangerous errand. A fisherman on the Vietnamese coast, a man named Kiem, spent years learning to practice each ordinary morning of his life, in a place where the danger never fully went away and simply had to be lived alongside. Season after season, Kiem's son Bin had taken to the sea as a young man, following his father's trade, and every morning before dawn, in the cool dark, before the sun touched the water, Kiem walked with him down to the small wooden boats lined along the shore. The sand still damp and cold underfoot, helped him check the nets by lantern light, and watched him push off into water that had, over the years, taken the lives of 2 other men from their village. In the early years of Bin's fishing, Kiem stood on the shore each morning until the boat was entirely out of sight, straining his eyes against the horizon as the sky slowly lightened from black to grey to pale gold, his chest tight with the same worry Hyun had once carried up a mountain road in his mind. One morning, watching his father stand rigid on the sand long after the boat had vanished, the tide slowly rising around his father's bare feet, Bin, home early with a poor catch, walked up quietly behind him and asked him gently why he still did this every single day, year after year, when nothing his standing there had ever once changed. "I don't know," Kiem admitted. "It feels wrong to simply turn away, as though turning away means I have stopped caring whether you come home." "But you have always cared," Bin said. "Standing on the sand has never once been what brought me home safely. The boat brings me home. The weather brings me home. My own 2 hands bring me home. Your standing there only takes something out of you every single morning, something I would rather you kept for yourself." Kiem thought about this for a long moment, watching his son's tired but steady face, so much like his own at that age, weathered already by years of sun and salt. The next morning, after the boat pushed off, he made himself turn back toward the house before it had fully vanished from sight, forcing his feet to move against every old instinct that told him he was somehow abandoning his post. It felt strange, almost wrong, like a small betrayal of love itself. His hands restless at his sides the whole walk home. But by the following week, it had become simply a different way of loving his son, one that left him with enough of himself remaining to actually be present when Bin returned each evening, mending nets or sharing a meal, rather than hollowed out from a morning spent staring at an empty horizon. Letting the boat go was not one decision made once. It was 100 small decisions, made every single morning, disguised as simply turning back toward the house. Years later, When Bin had sons of his own who took to the sea in turn, Kiem would sometimes catch his son standing too long on the sand, watching a boat disappear, and would walk over and simply put a hand on his shoulder, saying nothing, letting the gesture alone remind him of what Bin himself had once had to teach his own father. Both Hyun and Kiem discovered the same difficult truth from very different distances. Hyun learned it in a single, unbearable week of testing. Kiem learned it slowly, morning after ordinary morning, the way most real change actually happens, not in a single dramatic turning, but in 1,000 small, unglamorous choices to set the worry down again and again. Each time it quietly returned, uninvited, the way old habits always do. This does not mean you love the people in your life any less by refusing to suffer over them in advance. It means the love was never actually housed in the suffering to begin with. It was housed in the presence you have left over once the suffering is finally set down. The presence to truly listen when they return, to truly see them when they walk back through the door, rather than meeting them as an exhausted witness to imagined dangers that never came. A parent who has spent the whole day braced for disaster has less left over for the actual reunion than one who trusted the day to unfold as it would and simply waited, rested, to hear about it. There is a particular grief hidden inside constant worry that rarely gets named. It is the grief of missing the person you love while they are still right in front of you. Because some part of your attention never quite returned from wherever your fear sent it earlier that day. You may be standing on your own version of that shore tonight, watching some boat you cannot control disappear into a distance you cannot follow. The people you love are not made safer by your sleeplessness on their behalf. They are only met, when they do return, by whichever version of you your worry has left standing there. Let yourself turn back toward the house now, the way Kiem finally learned to, not because you have stopped caring, but because caring and suffering were never actually required to travel together, however long the habit of pairing them has lasted. Let your chest soften around whoever you have been holding vigil for tonight, wherever they are, however far from you, whatever distance or silence currently sits between you. Feel your own breath settle into its own rhythm, no longer trying to keep pace with a danger it was never actually able to reach. Let your shoulders lower, the particular weight of standing watch finally set down, at least for tonight. The people you love will be met tomorrow by whichever version of yourself you allow to rest tonight. And a rested version of you has so much more to offer them than an exhausted one ever could. And somewhere quieter still, in the deepest hours now approaching, a stranger question was beginning to surface. One that does not ask who you are worried about, or what you fear might happen to them, but something closer to the root of it all. It is the question of who, exactly, is the one who has been doing all this worrying, night after night, standing on shore after shore, holding vigil after vigil. And whether that quiet watcher was ever quite the same thing as the fear it kept carrying so faithfully all these years. And somewhere quieter still, past the shore where Kiem once stood watching a boat disappear into the pale morning distance, a stranger question had been waiting all along. One that does not ask what you are afraid of, but who exactly has been doing the fearing. There is a particular kind of relief available only to those willing to ask a strange question honestly. Who, precisely, is worried right now? Not what you are worried about. Not the content of the fear. The boat. The bell. The trembling hand, the shelf of unsold pots, the worrier itself. Most of us have never actually looked for it directly, assuming it to be simply us, solid and continuous. The same one who was worried yesterday and will be worried tomorrow. The same one who will presumably still be worried next week about something not yet imagined. But looked at closely, in the particular quiet of a night like this one, that assumption tends to soften in ways that can be difficult to put into words. The way a knot loosens the moment you stop pulling on it and simply look at how it was tied. The Buddhist teaching on the nature of self says something that sounds almost like a riddle until it is lived rather than merely heard. It says that what we call the self is not a fixed thing standing behind our thoughts and feelings, directing them like a puppeteer, but something closer to the weather passing through an open sky, arising and dissolving, to never quite the same twice. And that the sky itself, the awareness in which all of this passes, has never once been shaken by any storm that has crossed it, however violent that storm believed itself to be. Long ago, in a small monastery in the bamboo forests of Tran Dynasty, Vietnam, a young monk named Thien was given an unusual instruction by his teacher, one that would change entirely how he understood his own worry. Thien had come to his teacher, Master Hugh, in genuine distress, arriving at the small hut just after the evening bell, his robes dusty from the long walk down from the upper terraces, where he had been unable to concentrate on his tasks for days on end. For months he had been unable to sleep, his mind circling endlessly through fears about his aging mother, who lived 3 villages away and whose letters had grown shorter and less frequent. The monastery's uncertain harvest, threatened that year by an early frost, and his own doubts about whether he belonged in robes at all, a question that surfaced most cruelly in the small hours when sleep would not come. He described all of this to Hugh in detail, the words tumbling out faster than he intended, expecting sympathy, or perhaps a teaching on how to quiet such thoughts. Hugh listened without interrupting, his weathered face calm in the lamplight, and when Thien finally fell silent, exhausted from the telling, the old teacher simply said, "Bring me the one who is worried." Thien blinked, uncertain he had heard correctly. "Teacher, you have told me a great deal about your worries," Hugh said, setting down the small cup of tea he had been holding, "but you have not shown me the one doing the worrying. Go and find that one, and bring it here to me, and I will help you with your fear." Thien walked away from that meeting more confused than he had arrived, but he took the instructions seriously, as he took all his teacher's instructions. For 3 days, he searched. He sat in meditation on the small wooden platform outside his sleeping quarters, the bamboo forest rustling around him in the mountain wind, watching his thoughts closely, looking for the solid, continuous self he assumed must be generating all this worry. He found thoughts about his mother, arising and passing, vivid one moment and gone the next, replaced by something else entirely, a memory of her voice, then simply silence again. He found thoughts about the harvest, arising and passing, images of frost-blackened rice giving way just as quickly to memories of the smell of rain on dry soil from some earlier, better season. He found the old, familiar doubt about his robes, arising and passing, sharp and painful in one instant and strangely absent the next, as though it had never been there at all. But each time he reached for the one who was supposedly having these thoughts, the one worrying, the one who owned all this fear and carried it forward from moment to moment, he found only more thoughts, more sensations, more passing weather, and never once anything solid enough to actually bring back to his teacher and hand over. By the second day, Teen had grown almost desperate in his search, examining every corner of his experience with an intensity that itself began to feel like its own kind of grasping. His shoulders tight from hours of sitting, his mind circling back on itself again and again. He looked in his chest, where the worry seemed to physically live, a tightness beneath his ribs that ached by midday. He looked in his mind, where the thoughts themselves seemed to originate. He looked in the space between one thought and the next, in the brief silences where nothing at all seemed to be happening. Nowhere did he find a fixed, unchanging warrior standing behind any of it. Only the worrying itself, moving through, arising and dissolving the way ripples move across the surface of a pond without ever becoming the pond. On the third evening, frustrated and strangely unsettled by what he had not found, Thien returned to Huey's small hut, the bamboo forest dark and rustling behind him. "I cannot find it," he admitted, sitting down heavily across from his teacher. "I have searched everywhere a worry could hide, and there is no one there. Only the worrying itself, moving through, like clouds crossing open sky." Hugh smiled, the first time he had done so since Thien had first come to him in distress 3 days before. And has the sky ever once been torn apart by a passing cloud? Teen considered this carefully, turning the question over the way he had turned over every thought during his search. "No," he said slowly. "The sky simply lets the cloud pass through it, unchanged by whatever shape or shadow the cloud happens to carry." "Then perhaps," Hugh said, leaning forward slightly, "you have been mistaking yourself for the weather all this time, when you were always... In fact, the sky does not need to stop the clouds from forming. It does not need to chase them away or hold them in place. It only needs to remain exactly what it already is, spacious enough to let anything pass through without being changed by any of it." Dean sat with this for a long moment, the evening light fading outside the small window of Hugh's hut, something in his chest loosening in a way he had not felt in months. He thought of his mother, still a real concern, still worthy of care, and found that the worry about her now moved differently through him. Still present, still tender, but no longer mistaken for the whole of who he was. He thought of the harvest, of his doubts, and found the same strange spaciousness around each of them, room enough to hold real concern without being consumed entirely by it, the way a large room can hold a small fire without the room itself catching flame. He walked back up to his sleeping quarters that night, through the dark bamboo forest, the leaves whispering overhead, in a wind he barely noticed anymore. The same path he had walked in distress 3 days before, and noticed, almost with surprise, that his steps felt lighter, though nothing about his actual circumstances had changed. His mother's health was still uncertain. The frost had still damaged the crop, and yet something essential had shifted in how all of it sat within him. He had spent 3 days searching for the one who worried, and had found instead only worry itself, passing through an awareness that was never actually shaken by any of it, however convincing each passing thought had felt in its moment. In the weeks that followed, Theon's fears did not disappear entirely. His mother's health remained uncertain, and a letter finally arrived some weeks later with difficult news that required his full attention and care, prompting a trip home he had once dreaded, but now met with a strange, steady calm. The harvest remained a real concern for the monastery, requiring practical planning and genuine effort from every monk. Long days spent assessing which fields might still be saved. But something in how he held these things had shifted permanently. The way a sky does not need a storm to end before it can remain. Underneath a storm, exactly as vast and unbothered as it always was, he found himself able to act clearly on what needed acting on. The letter answered. The harvest planning attended to. Without the accompanying exhaustion of believing that his suffering over these things was itself doing some necessary work. What Theon discovered in his teacher's hut was not a technique for eliminating worry, but a recognition that changes the entire relationship to it. You are not the flame that flickers and gutters with every passing draft of fear. You are the space in which the flame burns. The quiet that was there before the first worried thought arose tonight, and will still be there after the last one finally passes. The flame needs tending. Yes, the way real concerns deserve real attention. The way Theon still needed to answer his mother's letter and help plan for the harvest. But the space around it has never once needed protecting from the flame's flickering, because the space was never actually threatened by it in the first place. This is easy to hear as merely comforting words, and much harder to actually feel, because the mind so readily reasserts itself as the warrior, as the one who must hold everything together through sheer vigilant effort, refusing to relinquish the role even when shown, clearly, that it was never truly suited to it. But notice, even now, as you consider this idea, that there is something reading these words, something aware of whatever reaction is arising in you, whether interest, or skepticism, or a kind of tired longing for this to be true. That, noticing itself, quiet and unhurried, has not been disturbed by a single thought that has passed through it tonight. Not the worry, not the doubt, not even the wondering about whether any of this makes sense. Notice, if you can, whatever worry has been moving through you tonight, and notice too the quiet in which it has been moving. That quiet has not been disturbed by a single one of your thoughts. Not tonight. Not any night before this one. It has simply been holding them, spacious and unbothered, the way it always has, the way it always will, long after tonight's particular worries have dissolved into whatever comes next. You are not required to become the storm simply because a storm happens to be passing through you tonight, however loud its thunder, or however dark its clouds. Let your body rest now in that same wide, unbothered quiet, the sky beneath all of tonight's weather. Feel your breath moving without needing you to direct it, thoughts arising and dissolving without needing you to chase or resist a single one of them. Each one simply passing the way clouds pass, some thin and quick, some heavier and slower, none of them staying, none of them needing to. Feel the weight of your body settling into whatever is holding it right now. The bed, the stillness of the room, the particular quiet of this hour, none of it disturbed by anything your mind has been doing. There is nothing here that needs holding together. There never was. And somewhere further into this deep and spacious quiet, one more shape was beginning to form. softer than fear, closer to simple tiredness. The particular tiredness of not knowing how much longer a difficult season will actually last. It is the quiet weariness of waiting itself, of watching days pass without the relief you have been hoping for, and wondering whether the waiting might be its own kind of weather too, passing in its own good time, through the same wide sky that has been holding everything else tonight. That weariness settles into the body long before it ever settles into words. It was there tonight, quiet and unnamed, moving through the same wide, patient sky that had just finished holding everything else. The particular tiredness of not knowing how much longer a difficult season will actually last, of wondering whether the waiting itself might simply be its own kind of weather, patient and unhurried, no matter how endless it felt from the inside. There is a tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. It comes from counting, from marking days against a hardship that refuses to announce its own ending, from waking each morning and asking the same unanswerable question before your feet have even touched the floor. You may know this feeling from a long illness with no clear date of recovery, a difficult year at work with no visible turn ahead, a grief that seems to have no schedule at all, a relationship slowly mending with no promised day when the mending will feel complete, no calendar anyone can hand you marked with the date. All of this finally resolves. The not knowing becomes its own separate weight, heavier sometimes than the hardship itself. A second burden stacked quietly on top of the first. Long ago, in the mountains above Kyoto, where terraced rice fields climbed the slopes in patient, curving lines that had been shaped by many generations of careful hands, in the 10th year of a farmer's quiet, ordinary life, a season came that would not end when it was supposed to. Kenji had farmed the terraced slopes above his village for as long as he could remember. The same fields his father and grandfather had worked before him. And he knew, the way farmers know such things without needing to be told, roughly when the rains should come each spring to soften the earth for planting. That year, they did not come. The sky stayed a flat, pale white for weeks, then months, empty of even the promise of clouds, the soil turning to dust between his fingers, fine and grey, the young shoots he had planted in hope shriveling before they ever found their footing, curling brown at the edges within days of breaking the surface. Kenji began marking each dry day with a small notch cut into the wooden post beside his door, using the same worn knife his father had once used for the same purpose during a lesser drought decades before, a habit that started as simple record-keeping and slowly became something closer to a private torment. Each new notch, a fresh reminder that the waiting had grown longer than the last time he had dared to count, longer than any dry season he could remember hearing about, even from the oldest farmers in the village. By the 40th notch, Kenji had stopped sleeping well, lying awake each night, listening for rain that never came, the roof silent above him, when it should have been drumming with water by now, calculating and recalculating how many more days the terraces could survive without water. How many more weeks before the entire year's planting would simply be lost beyond any recovery. He walked his fields each morning not to tend them, for there was little left to tend. The soil too dry and cracked for any real work, but to search the sky for clouds that were never there, and to add one more mark to the post, the small blade he used growing dull from so much use. His neighbor, an old widow named Fuyu, who had farmed the slope beside his for even longer than he had lived, found him one evening standing at the notched post as though it might, if watched closely enough, finally reveal an answer. The evening light, fading gold and thin across the dry, cracked terraces below them both. "You have been counting," she said, settling slowly onto the low stone wall beside his gate, her joints stiff from her own long day, bent over her own struggling fields. 40 days, Kenji said, not looking away from the post. "Maybe more before this ends. I don't know how much longer any of us can wait." Fuyu looked past him toward the small stand of bamboo growing wild at the edge of his property, its stalks pale and seemingly lifeless in the drought, bent slightly under weeks of relentless sun. Not a single new shoot visible anywhere along its length. The whole stand looking, to any ordinary eye, entirely dead. "Do you know how bamboo grows?" she asked. "It doesn't," Kenji said, gesturing at the sorry stand with something close to bitterness in his voice. "Not this year. Not for longer than I can remember, if I'm honest. For years, sometimes 5, sometimes more," Fuyu said, settling more comfortably against the stone wall, her voice steady and unhurried in the dimming light. "A bamboo plant sends down roots and shows almost nothing above the soil. A farmer who did not know better might dig it up, as certain it had died, certain all that effort had produced nothing at all worth keeping. And then, in a single season, once the roots have finally spread far enough underground, it grows several feet in a matter of weeks, faster than almost anything else that grows. It was never dying during those quiet years. It was only growing somewhere you could not see." Kenji looked at the still, pale stalks at the edge of his land, unmoved by anything Fuyu had said, his eyes tired from weeks of scanning an empty sky, and yet something in her words settled into him anyway. The way water settles slowly into dry ground rather than all at once, disappearing first before it can be seen doing any good at all. "I cannot tell you when the rain will come," Fuyu said, her voice calm and unhurried in the fading evening light, the last color draining slowly from the western sky behind her. "Neither can the bamboo tell you when it will finally show itself above the ground. But counting the days you have already survived, marking them like a punishment, only teaches your body to live inside the waiting, as though the waiting itself were the disaster, rather than simply the space before whatever comes next. The rain will come the day it comes, not a day sooner for all your counting, and not a day later either." Kenji did not stop counting entirely, not right away. Old habits, once carved into wood and repeated daily for weeks, do not disappear in a single evening's conversation. However wise, the words that prompted the change, but something in how he counted began, slowly, to change. He stopped adding new notches to the post that same week, and instead began simply walking his fields each morning without needing them to show him anything, tending what little could still be tended, pulling weeds from soil too dry to grow much of anything else, checking the low stone irrigation channels for any small blockage he could clear, simply because tending was still something his hands knew how to do, regardless of when relief arrived, regardless of whether the sky ever answered his watching at all. The rain came on the 63rd day, though by then Kenji had lost precise count, having stopped adding notches weeks before, arriving suddenly in the middle of a grey afternoon, first as a few scattered drops against the dry earth, dark spots spreading slowly across the pale dust, like ink across old paper. Then, as a full, soaking downpour that lasted through the night, drumming steadily against the roof in a rhythm Kenji had almost forgotten the shape of. Kenji stood in his doorway and watched it fall. The smell of wet dust, rising thick and sweet from ground that had been parched for months. That particular smell of rain on long dry earth that seemed to reach some deep, old part of him. Older than the drought. Older than his own memory of ever needing to count anything at all. And felt something in his chest release that had been held tight since the 40th notch. Perhaps longer. Perhaps since the very first dry morning, he had noticed the sky was staying too pale for too long. Within 2 weeks, the small bamboo stand at the edge of his property had grown taller than Kenji himself. Shoots he had never seen coming, rising fast and green from roots that had clearly been working. Patiently, in the dark soil all along, pushing up through earth, still soft and dark from the rain, unfurling new leaves within days of breaking the surface. Each stalk thickening visibly from one morning to the next in a way that seemed almost impossible after so many months of apparent stillness. He walked past it each morning now with something closer to wonder than the despair he had carried past its stillness for so many weeks. Sometimes stopping simply to place his palm against one of the new, cool stalks, feeling the faint give of something still growing beneath his hand. The bamboo had not been dying at all. It had simply been growing somewhere Kenji could not see. What Fuyu offered Kenji that evening was not a date, because there was no date to give. It was something quieter and more useful than certainty, permission to stop measuring the hardship by how long it had already lasted, and to simply keep tending what could still be tended, trusting that whatever was happening beneath the visible surface of things was still happening, whether or not any of it could be counted or seen. This is a difficult permission to accept, because the mind so badly wants a number, a date, a fixed point on some calendar where the hardship promises to end, something solid enough to hold on to in the dark. Without that number, the mind often fills the gap with dread instead, treating the not knowing itself as evidence that things are worse than they actually are, as though uncertainty and catastrophe were somehow the same thing, wearing different names. You may be counting your own version of Kenji's notches tonight, marking days, or weeks, or months, against a difficulty that has not yet shown you its ending. Perhaps it is a health concern still working its way toward diagnosis, a job search stretching longer than you expected, a friendship or family rift you cannot yet see the other side of, a slow recovery from something that broke and has not yet finished mending. The counting rarely makes the waiting shorter. It only makes each day heavier than it needed to be, a fresh weight added to an already tired shoulder. One more notch, cut into a post that was never going to answer back, no matter how many marks you carved into it. Whatever season you are moving through will end the way every season eventually does, in its own time, unhurried by your watching, unmoved by how carefully you have counted the days already spent inside it. Let your body rest now, the way dry ground rests before rain. Not empty, only waiting, still fully capable of everything it will need to do once the water finally comes. Let your breath settle, unmeasured, uncounted, simply moving the way breath has always moved through every long season anyone has ever survived, in and out, without needing to know how many more breaths remain before the difficulty passes. You do not need to know the exact day this particular hardship ends in order to rest tonight. Feel your shoulders lower. The particular weight of counting finally set down, at least for these few remaining hours before sleep fully arrives. Something in you may be growing in the dark right now, the way the bamboo was, quietly, patiently, in roots too deep to see, needing nothing from you but the ordinary, unglamorous tending you are already capable of, one small day at a time, one small breath at a time, without any need to know in advance exactly how many more days or breaths remain before whatever is growing finally shows itself. And somewhere further still, in the deepest hours of this long night, a finale, quieter trust was beginning to settle in, one that does not ask you to count the days remaining in any hardship at all, only to believe, the way a river believes without needing to be told, that everything moving through it, every hard season, every long winter, every drought and every waiting, eventually finds its own way to wherever it is going, without ever once needing to be pushed there faster than it was already, patiently going. Trust like that does not arrive all at once. It arrives the way thaw arrives, slow and unannounced, one quiet degree at a time, long before anyone standing on the bank can actually see it happening, long before there is any visible sign that anything at all has begun to shift beneath the still, frozen surface. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from trying to hurry something that was never going to be hurried. No matter how much effort is thrown against it, no matter how early one rises, or how hard one works at the edges of a thing that answers only to its own time. You may know it as the urge to push a slow recovery, to force a hard conversation before either person is ready, to will a difficult season closed a week sooner simply because you cannot bear one more day of it exactly as it is. Perhaps it shows up as reorganizing the same plan for the 5th time, hoping a new arrangement of the same facts might somehow speed the outcome, or checking on a decision that is still pending, as though checking more often could make the answer arrive any sooner. The trying rarely speeds anything up. It only tires the one doing the trying. While the actual thing, the healing, the thaw, the turning, continues on whatever timeline it was always going to keep, entirely unmoved by how much energy has been spent trying to rush it. Long ago, at a small mountain temple in Muromachi-era Japan, tucked into a quiet valley where the winters ran long and hard, a young monk named Sora spent an entire winter learning this from a frozen river that ran along the edge of the temple grounds. Each year, when the temple's river froze solid enough to walk across, its surface going grey and opaque as stone, the monks drew their water from a hole cut through the ice near the bank, chipped open each morning and refrozen each night through the coldest weeks of winter. Sora had been given this task for the first time that year, rising in the dark cold before the other monks stirred, his breath forming small clouds in the lantern light as he worked. The whole temple silent around him, except for the distant sound of his own axe against ice. And as the season wore on, he grew increasingly impatient with how slowly the ice seemed to loosen its grip as spring approached. He began arriving earlier each morning, chipping harder and longer than the task required, the sound of his axe against ice echoing sharp across the silent riverbank, certain that if he simply worked hard enough at the edges of the ice, he could hurry the whole river back into motion sooner. By the 6th week, Sora's hands were raw and blistered beneath his mittens, small cracks opening across his knuckles from the constant cold and effort, his shoulders aching from the daily effort, a dull soreness that had settled into him and refused to leave even on his rest days, his sleep growing thin and restless from the accumulated strain, and the river, for all his work, showed no sign of thawing any faster than it would have on its own. If anything, the extra chipping had cracked and weakened parts of the bank he had not meant to touch, leaving jagged, dangerous edges where the ice met the frozen mud, small fractures spreading outward from his work in patterns he had not intended and could not fully control, patterns that would take the bank itself far longer to heal than the winter alone would ever have caused. One grey morning, the temple's old caretaker, a monk everyone simply called Getsu, found Sora already at the riverbank before dawn, breathing hard, his small axe raised for another swing at ice that had not visibly changed in days, his lantern set on a nearby stone, throwing a small circle of warm light against the frozen white expanse of the river. The river is not going to move any faster for your effort, Getsu said, settling onto a nearby rock to watch, pulling his worn robe tighter against the early morning cold. I only want it thawed before the equinox, Sora said, not pausing his work, his breath coming in short, visible bursts against the cold morning air. The whole temple needs the water flowing freely again, and every morning it stays frozen is another morning of this same difficult chipping. And when the sun climbs a little higher each day, Getsu said, watching him closely, when the air warms by even a single degree, do you think the ice consults your schedule before it decides to loosen its hold on the water beneath it? Sora lowered his axe, breathing hard, the cold air stinging in his lungs, and looked at the ice, still thick and unmoved despite weeks of his effort, stretching grey and silent in every direction he could see. No, he admitted, his voice quieter now, almost lost in the cold morning air. It melts when it melts, regardless of anything I do here each morning. Then what has all this chipping actually accomplished? Getsu asked, not unkindly, his tone more curious than critical. Besides tiring your arms and cracking a bank that was never asking to be broken in the first place. Sora looked down at his raw, blistered palms, the skin cracked and reddened in the dim morning light, and then out at the wide, the frozen surface of the river, stretching calm and silent toward the far bank, unbothered by weeks of his effort against it, entirely indifferent to every early morning he had sacrificed trying to reach it. He thought of every morning he had risen in the dark, and certain his effort was the missing piece that would finally free the water sooner. Certain that his exhaustion was somehow doing necessary work that the river itself could not do on its own. Work that, he now began to suspect, had never actually been necessary at all. The river did not need his hands, Getsu said gently, though Sora had not spoken his thought aloud. It only needed the sun, which was already, patiently, doing its own slow work above them both. The same work it does every year, with or without a monk chipping at the edges before dawn. The same warmth that has thawed this river every spring since long before either of us was born, and will continue thawing it every spring long after we are both gone. Sora set the axe down on the bank and simply sat for a while, watching his own breath fog in the cold morning air, listening closely to the particular silence of a frozen river, which is not the silence of something dead, but of something patiently waiting, holding itself still until the moment it no longer needs to. He returned to his morning task after that, cutting the water hole as needed. No more, and no less. His hands finally given the chance to heal, the raw places on his palms slowly closing over the following weeks as his mornings grew quieter and less strained. The river thawed that year on almost exactly the same date it always did, the ice first softening at its edges in the pale early light of a morning in early spring, cracking with soft, groaning sounds that carried across the still air like something waking from a long sleep, then breaking apart in slow, drifting sheets that carried themselves downstream without any hurrying at all, tumbling gently against each other as the current beneath finally found room to move after so many silent, motionless weeks. Sora stood on the bank that morning and watched it happen. The same bank where he had spent so many cold mornings chipping in vain, his breath still fogging faintly in the lingering chill, and felt something settle in him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air. The water moved past him now, dark and swift, and entirely unconcerned with how long he had once tried to hurry it, carrying small chunks of ice downstream like offerings to whatever came next. The sound of it rushing and alive after so many silent weeks. What Getsu offered Sora that cold morning was not a faster thaw, but permission to stop mistaking his own exhaustion for progress. The river had never once needed rescuing from its own winter. It only needed time, and the same patient sun that returns every year regardless of how anyone on the bank happens to feel about the wait. This is not the same as doing nothing at all. Sora still needed to cut the water hole each morning for the temple's actual, practical needs. Still needed to tend to what genuinely required tending. Still needed to show up each day with the same steady care as before. The difference was subtle but complete. One kind of effort met an actual need, present and specific, small and sufficient, while the other kind of effort was simply fear dressed as diligence. Straining against a timeline that was never going to move, regardless of how hard anyone pushed against it. Spending strength on a battle that had already been decided by the sun long before the axe ever touched the ice. Real tending and anxious forcing can look almost identical from the outside, both involving an axe, both involving cold mornings and tired arms, both requiring the same early rising and the same disciplined presence at the riverbank. And yet, only one of them actually helps anything at all, while the other simply exhausts the one holding it. You may be standing on your own frozen riverbank tonight, chipping away at something that was always going to loosen on its own timeline, tiring yourself against a pace that has never once answered to force. Perhaps it is a wound still healing on its own schedule, a plan still taking shape before it can be spoken aloud. A relationship finding its way back together, one small season at a time. A decision still forming, somewhere out of view that no amount of anxious checking will bring to the surface any sooner. Whatever season you are hoping to hurry along, spring or otherwise, is already moving towards you the way it always has, unhurried by your effort and unslowed by your rest. You do not have to chip at the ice tonight in order for the thaw to eventually come. Let your hands rest now, the axe set down, the way Sora's finally were, palms open against whatever is beneath you, raw places allowed to simply heal rather than be pressed back into more work. Let your breath find its own quiet rhythm, unhurried, the way water moves once it has finally been allowed to move again. In, and a slow, easy out. No forcing, no straining towards some imagined finish line. Whatever in your life is frozen tonight will thaw the way rivers always thaw. Not because you worked harder at the edges, but because warmth was always, patiently, already on its way, moving towards you at exactly the pace it has always kept, season after season, long before you were born and long after tonight has passed. Feel your shoulders lower, the particular ache of pushing against something unmovable finally allowed to rest. Muscle by muscle, releasing a tension you may not have even noticed you were carrying until this very moment. Feel the weight of your body settling more fully into whatever is holding it right now. No longer needing to prove anything through effort. No longer needing the ice broken before you are permitted. This stillness. The river will move when it moves. The sun will climb when it climbs. And you, tonight, are allowed simply to rest beside whatever is still frozen in your own life, trusting the same patient warmth that has never once failed to arrive, in its own unhurried time, exactly as it always has. You do not need the ice fully broken before you are allowed to rest beside it tonight. Still frozen or not, still waiting or not, somewhere far beneath tonight's frozen surface, past every hard season this night has already walked you through, a single small flame is still waiting, the same one that first appeared cupped in two hands at the very beginning of these hours, still burning, still tended, whether or not every difficulty around it has finished resolving itself. It was never waiting for the thaw to be complete before it was allowed to keep its own quiet warmth alive. Somewhere far beneath tonight's frozen surface, a single small flame is still waiting, the same one that first appeared cupped in two hands, still burning, still tended, whether or not every difficulty around it has finished resolving itself, whether or not every question this long night has raised has found its answer before morning. There is a particular quiet that comes only after a long night of setting things down, one by one, the watching, the counting, the rehearsing, the holding on. It does not ask you to have finished anything. It does not require every worry to be resolved, every boat to be home, every storm to have passed. It only asks you to notice that you are still here, still breathing, still held by something wider than any single worry could ever be. The way a single flame is held by an entire dark sky that was never once threatened by its flickering. Many years after the winter, she first learned to let a lantern burn without her endless watching. Susu was an old woman, her hair silver, her hands soft with age, and marked with the small spots that come from a long life spent outdoors, sitting on the same rocks, above the same cove where she had once spent so many sleepless nights, the salt air as familiar to her now as her own breath. The lantern was tended now by her great niece, a young woman named Nao, who had taken up the same post Suzu once held with the same quiet devotion. And this evening, a storm was building out over the water, while Suzu's grandson, Kaito, was still out with the fleet, later returning than usual, the wind picking up in slow, testing gusts along the cliff path, the sky to the west already darkening into something heavier than ordinary evening, now stood at the lantern house door, watching the darkening horizon, with the same tight, anxious posture Suzu remembered wearing herself, decades ago, in this very spot, her young hands gripping the doorframe the way Suzu's had once gripped a wet branch of lowest bark, the way fear always seems to find some solid thing to hold on to. "Grandmother," Nao said. Should we watch for his boat? I can't just sit here while he's still out there, not knowing. Suzu looked at the young woman's face, so familiar in its worry. The same furrowed brow, the same held breath, and felt the old pull rise in her own chest too. Faint, but recognizable. The same reflex that had once kept her rigid against a stone wall for 3 sleepless nights so many years ago. She let it rise, and did not fight it, and did not follow it either, simply letting it move through her, the way a wave moves through water without needing to become the whole ocean. You can watch if you need to, Suzu said, her voice calm and unhurried. I am simply going to sit here beside you. But aren't you afraid for him? Nao asked, glancing back at her grandmother with something like confusion in her eyes. I am, Suzu said simply. The fear and the sitting still can both be true at the same time. I learned that a long time ago, from someone wiser than I was, in a storm not so different from this one. The wind gathered itself along the cliff, rattling the shutters of the lantern house, and out on the dark water. No light yet marked Kaito's return. Suzu did not rise to search the horizon. She simply sat, her old hands loose in her lap, feeling the cold night air against her face, the same salt-heavy wind that had once carried the sound of hulls creaking at anchor on her very first night as keeper. Listening to the waves below the way she had listened to them for most of her long life, and let the unanswered question about her grandson's boat remain exactly that, unanswered, without needing to hold it upright through her own sleeplessness the way she once believed she had to. Nao sat down beside her, eventually, still watching the water, still afraid, her knees drawn up against the cold, her young shoulders tense in a way Suzu recognized all too well. And Suzu simply let her, offering no instruction, no correction, only her own steady, unhurried presence beside the younger woman's fear. The two of them sitting in a silence that held more comfort than words might have managed. 2 generations of the same lineage of worry finally, quietly, breaking its oldest habit. The storm broke an hour later, rain sweeping in hard off the water, in cold, stinging sheets, and still no light appeared on the horizon, marking Kaito's boat. Suzu's chest tightened once, sharply, an old and familiar clench, and she breathed through it the way she had learned to breathe through so many things across so many years, not resisting the fear, not feeding it either, simply letting it move through her, the way weather moves through an open sky, arriving, staying a while, darkening everything for a moment, and eventually, always, passing on to wherever weather goes, once it has finished with a particular night. She did not know, in that moment, whether her grandson's boat had found safe harbor somewhere down the coast, or was still fighting its way home through the storm, or had come to some harm. The fear inside her kept quietly, suggesting in its old, familiar voice, the same voice that had once kept her awake for entire seasons at a time. She would not know for certain until morning, and for the first time in her long life, she found she could sit with exactly that unresolved shape, the not knowing, without needing it solved before she allowed herself any rest at all. The rain drumming steadily against the roof of the lantern house behind them, a sound she had heard 1,000 times before and would likely hear 1,000 times again. The lantern beside them burned on, untroubled by the storm, tended earlier that evening by Nao's careful hands, and needing nothing further from either of them now but to be left alone to do what fire does. Its small orange light, steady against the driving rain. The same light that had guided boats home for longer than either woman had been alive. The same flame, in spirit, if not in years, that Suzu had once nearly worn herself out protecting. Suzu felt her own eyes growing heavy despite the storm, despite the unanswered question still sitting quietly in her chest, and did not fight the tiredness the way she once would have. She thought, briefly, of an old monk who had once told her, on a night much like this one, that hands could rest while still holding, that watching was never the same as loving, that the flame she had spent so many young years guarding had never actually needed her sleeplessness at all. She thought of the fisherman she had once been so certain she was protecting simply by refusing to close her eyes, and of how little that certainty had ever actually done for anyone but exhaust her, leaving her less, not more, capable of meeting whatever the mornings after those long nights actually required of her. She did not need to remember his exact words to feel them settle into her body now. Decades later, on this same stretch of rock above the same restless sea, the understanding no longer something she had to consciously recall, but something that had simply become the shape of how she moved through nights like this one. "Come inside when you're ready," Suzu said to Neo, rising slowly, her old joints stiff from the cold and the sitting, the ache of many years settling into her knees as she stood, an ache she had grown used to accepting rather than fighting, much like everything else about this particular kind of night. The boat will come home when it comes home. There is nothing more either of us can do for it tonight except rest, and rest will not make the storm any worse. Whatever your body might be telling you right now. Neo stayed a while longer at the cliff's edge, still young enough to need a little more time with her own fear before she could set it down, her eyes still fixed on the dark, restless water where a single small light might yet appear. And Suzu did not wait for her, did not stand vigil at the door the way she once might have. She went inside, moving slowly through the small, familiar rooms of the house she had lived in for most of her life, past the low table, where she had eaten 10,000 ordinary meals, past the window where she had once watched for storms that never came and some that did, and lay down on her worn mat, the same mat she had slept on for longer than Neo had been alive, and let sleep find her the way it always eventually did. The unresolved night still unresolved around her, the storm still moving somewhere, out over water she could no longer see from where she lay. Kaito's boat came home safely before dawn, delayed by the storm but unharmed, having simply waited out the worst of it in a sheltered cove further down the coast, exactly as it likely would have, whether or not anyone had spent the night awake dreading otherwise. Suzu woke to the ordinary sound of nets being carried up from the shore, the familiar creak of wet rope and wood, her grandson's voice calling a greeting to his sister somewhere near the water, and felt no particular surprise at the good outcome, only a quiet, familiar gratitude that asked nothing further of her than to simply notice it, to let it settle into her, the way morning light settles slowly into a room that has been dark all night. She rose and walked down to the shore herself, moving slowly in the cool morning air, the sand still damp from the night's rain, and found Kaito there among the other fishermen, tired but whole, his boat pulled up onto the sand, the storm already becoming just another story to be told over the evening meal, the kind of story fishing families had always told, ordinary and survivable, the way most storms in most lives eventually turn out to be? He caught sight of her and waved, unaware of the particular quality of the night his grandmother had just spent, unaware that she had learned, finally and completely, something it had taken her an entire lifetime to fully understand, something she suspected she would spend whatever years remained to her quietly passing on, not through instruction, but through the simple, visible example of a woman who no longer needed a storm to end before she could rest inside it. You do not have to know how tonight ends in order to rest through it. Whatever is still out on the water of your own life tonight, whatever boat has not yet come home, whatever storm has not yet passed, whatever question remains genuinely, honestly unanswered, you are allowed to set it down now, exactly as it is, unresolved and unfinished, and let your body sink into rest anyway. This is not the same as no longer caring. Suzu cared for her grandson exactly as much on this last, restful night as she had during her most exhausting, sleepless vigils decades before. What had changed was never the caring. It was only the belief that her suffering was required alongside it, that love needed to be proven through exhaustion in order to be real. The flame does not need your eyes to keep burning. It never did. Not on the first night this was ever true, and not on this one either. Let your breath come slow now, unhurried, the way it always eventually does, when there is truly nothing left to hold on to but this single, ordinary moment. Let your hands soften wherever they are resting, palms loose, fingers heavy, nothing left to grip, nothing left to guard. Let your shoulders sink fully into whatever is holding you, the mattress, the stillness, the quiet dark of this room, the accumulated weight of an entire long night finally allowed to rest. Whatever you have been carrying tonight, through every hour and every story and every small release, can simply rest here beside you now, unsolved, unfinished, entirely allowed to remain exactly as it is until morning decides, in its own time, what it will become. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. The lantern is still burning. It always was. Through every message this long night has carried you through every story of hands finally learning to open, through every hour of setting something down that once felt impossible to release. And you, whoever you are, wherever this night has found you, are already exactly where you need to be to finally, fully let go. Not because everything has been resolved, but because rest was never actually waiting on resolution in the first place. It was only ever waiting on permission. The same permission Suzu finally gave herself on that stormy cliff. The same permission you are equally free to give yourself now. In this quiet room, on this particular night, exactly as you are. Sleep now. The boat will come home when it comes home. The rest is not yours to hold awake any longer. A small flame, once carried so carefully across an open field, cupped tight against a wind that never once stopped trying to find it. Tonight, at last, the hands holding it have opened. The flame is still burning. It was never the wind that threatened it. It was only ever the grip. Tonight you walk through monasteries carved into the mountains of Tang and Song dynasty China, fishing villages along the coasts of old Japan and old Vietnam, a healer's stone house high in Tibet, a farmer's rice terraces above Kyoto, a potter's kiln in ancient India, A quiet bamboo grove in Tran Dynasty, Vietnam. Different centuries, different hands. The same quiet, unclenching. Again and again. Small and specific and real. Until it finally became yours. You do not have to earn your rest by finishing every worry first. You do not have to hold a single thing steady through the night in order to be safe. The people you love are not kept safe by your exhaustion. The mornings ahead are not made better by tonight's sleeplessness. You were only ever asked to breathe, to soften, to let the flame burn on its own, the way it always could, the way it always will. Long after this particular worry has quietly become something else entirely, let your whole body sink now, fully, into whatever is holding it. There is nowhere left to watch from tonight. Nothing left to guard. Before you go, I want to say this honestly. I built these nights out of the same worry I am asking you to set down, and writing them has taught me, slowly, the same thing I hope has reached you tonight. The watching was never what kept us safe. Tomorrow will arrive the way mornings always do, quietly, without needing your permission, without needing you to have solved anything first. Whatever waits for you there, easy or hard, will still be there, and you will meet it rested, which is the only real gift a long night like this one can actually give. If tonight found you, come back tomorrow night, and we will set something else down together. The flame is still burning. It always was. Let go now, gently, and let the dark hold you the way it has always been holding everything else in this room tonight. Patient and unhurried and entirely unbothered by how long it takes you to finally, fully rest.